Okay, this week's topic is the spaces of consumption, or is there such a thing as public space anymore? So to begin with, we're going to look at the history of spaces of consumption, and largely I'm going to talk a little bit about, talk about malls and shopping centres. There's been a lot of literature over the past couple of decades about consumer culture and about the ways that this has affected public space and how this is tied up with the development of technologies, development of things like import-exports, globalisation, and how these developments have fundamentally changed how we buy our stuff. Largely, we still buy things from necessity in a way, in terms of food and clothing, but really shopping as an activity has fundamentally changed over the past couple of decades, and this is what we're going to look at in this first section. So particularly the architecture and management of space. You can think about shopping centres, the way that they're set up to encourage certain acts. I mean, they pump smells into them to try and encourage us to buy things. Supermarkets for a while there were pumping in the smell of fresh bread and stuff like that to try and manipulate us. So there's all that kind of sensory stuff that goes on. What we're more interested in here is more the kind of architecture of space and the ways that maybe things like shopping malls have become the new town halls or the new public space. And this has implications on what public space means, because there's an argument therefore that it's being increasingly privatised. There's less and less space in the social world that we can go and do stuff without having to spend money, without having to deal with security guards, without kind of, doing something that's commercial. One of the interesting things that therefore happens with these developments is that while these spaces no doubt homogenise things, make them all the same, and there's commercial stuff going on, they also then become appropriated and there's subversive acts that go on. So, kids hang out at these places and don't buy anything, and they have confrontations with the security guards, or they walk around and sip a cup for 2 hours but not buy anything, and that kind of stuff.
Sit where you're not supposed to, loiter where you're not supposed to. And it's interesting that we think of malls as basically being open spaces, but of course they have opening and closing hours.
That's right.
They have everything's monitored. So although they give off the impression of being places you can hang out, like a public park or a town hall, there are strict limits on what you can and can't do. And I think people are always pushing those limits, but within quite a set of parameters. It's interesting in a lot of other countries where there's shopping malls are such nice spaces to be, because they're not noisy, they're air conditioned, there's no dust, there's no fumes, etc., etc., etc. But entry is often quite limited and restricted. So you get screened on entry, like an airport, go through a metal detector, put your bag through, etc., 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 and people are often turned away if they don't look the part. So they even less and less give that veneer of being public. Yeah,
and in public space here in the 90s, as these malls became, so ubiquitous, young people became a problem. They want young people to come and spend money. The ones that are doing stuff there in not the right way, they started doing stuff like playing classical music where kids were gathering to try and get them to move. There was a development of that kind of buzzy noise that apparently only like 16-year-olds could hear, that would try and get them to move on. So there's all this kind of use of technology in a way to regulate the consumption.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Make it as unattractive as possible on group.
Yeah. So public space, the architecture of space, the way space is used to control, I think is really well illustrated by the development of what Mike Davis points out in his really influential book about LA in the 80s and 90s. City of Courts, the bum-proof bench. This is a bench in public space, say a bus stop that's used for kind of sitting and waiting to do legitimate things like going to work and shopping, but designed in a way that if someone is in the unfortunate position of being homeless and not having anywhere to sleep, that they can't sleep on it, because, you can't have that kind of, unsightly stuff in your consumer paradise. So I think this is very much symbolic, I think, of the way that kind of corporations and governments think of the public. Positioning them as consumers when they're failed or flawed consumers, as Bauman talks about them. There's all kinds of uses of technology, architecture, and things to try and keep them out of that space. So Davis also points out, the aggressive use of sprinklers in parks turning them on at night and stuff like that, so people can't sleep in them.
And bright lights in bus shelters and things like that.
Under the guise often of safety,
yeah,
but really often to kind of keep people out.
Easily detect people's who are transgressing the kind of behaviours. There's lots of different versions of those benches too. In Australia, you tend to see they have a hard sort of armrest in the middle to stop people.
And there's the anti-skate stuff that's increasingly on stuff as too, like cement benches and cement steps where they'll put stuff on there to stop people grinding and things like that. Yeah. Okay, so in terms of the history of the development of these things, George Ritzer, the McDonaldization kind of theorist, talks about them as cathedrals of consumption. And this kind of has a lot of connotations in a way that as society becomes more secular, we move from kind of modernity to post-modernity, more rational societies. The argument is that therefore they're becoming more secular. So societies, communities, cultures need places to gather, and rather than those being churches, they become these more commercial spaces. So people in kind of the Ritzer sense go to worship, they go to worship stuff at these things. So there's a changing meaning here from how societies gather, how they function, and how we relate to each other. But there's still kind of the same sociality going on according to Ritzer's analysis. There's also a changing, when it comes to the development of things like malls and supermarkets, the meaning of market has changed. Yes. So again, in feudal society, necessity of going to buy the bread or the meat or whatever from the individual purveyor increasingly is done in this kind of mass marketed way. And there's a bunch of industrial technology advances that means our products come from further and further away than ever before. In the last couple of weeks, we'll point out a lot of those absurdities in terms of globalization and stuff like that, and inequalities. So these things very much relate to technical developments, the rise of cheap building materials, the development of steel, transport, the very invention of the fridge allows these things to kind of happen. So the sociological questions here become, do these mean there's more dehumanized relations going on where we relate to people rather than as maybe as kind of, priest and churchgoer, more as kind of, server and shopper. The server therefore has this kind of script, this kind of false friendliness. We go and kind of engage with that person to get some advice and buy stuff, but it's not real in that sense. And of course the internet comes along and challenges this. It almost seems quaint now to go to a shopping market as opposed to and have a laying on your back on the lounge and just ordering something and it turning up a few days later. Yeah,
exactly. And I think that it's also really interesting to think about how the more sort of traditional market was a long-term relationship often between buyer and seller because the location was smaller. You weren't coming from a long way away like you would to a shopping mall, and you're often over many years buying and selling to one another. It is romanticized a little bit, but that's quite different to the rapid turnover of staff you might find in a shopping mall. Like that person was there last month, now it's a different person, now it's a different person, they've been moved to another store, they're this. And so the dehumanizing element too is I guess has broken or severed that relationship between buyer and producer. However, you see a lot of a shift back, and we'll talk about that in other units towards wanting to buy crafted or handmade or bespoke or smaller things.
I've experienced a similar trajectory in, like, say, music buying. In the 80s and 90s, I would go to, brushes and big kind of CD joints, right?
The biggest.
But then my taste got more kind of specific, I started to go to kind of record stores. But then record stores kind of died, and the individual CD places kind of died off, and you end up only being able to go to places like JB and stuff in a place like Newcastle. But then they kind of made a comeback now, and there are record stores around where you can go and talk to the person, and they'll know the reference that you're speaking to and say, oh, maybe you want to buy this, and you have this relationship that kind of moves beyond just the point of exchange. So
it's a very interesting dynamic you describe, actually, of things getting obliterated and then popping up again when the demand sort of builds a little bit more.
So like you were talking about in the entanglement stuff, it's not a kind of straightforward trajectory of kind of moving from one thing to the next and something being obliterated. There tends to be a kind of to and froing in terms of these developments. Another important development in thinking about these changes from, as capitalism develops, is from kind of that market idea to kind of arcades and department stores and malls. And Walter Benjamin's really important work in terms of considering this, Frankfurt School theorist. Again, writing about how the new building materials and electricity lubricated changes from those kind of more simple markets to these kind of urban centres, and you can see the photo there of kind of the places that Benjamin was talking about, particularly in Paris. But what happens in this shift is that shopping moves from necessity to a leisure practice. And this again changes our relationship with things. So we start to develop what people call the shopper's gaze. People go window shopping, just go to a mall or go to look at stuff rather than buying things. It becomes a leisure practice in and of itself. Benjamin develops the idea of the flaneur as someone that's kind of, freely walking around experiencing the sensuous city, and that becomes a thing in and of itself to do. And Simmel, again a foundational kind of sociologist, argues that this kind of urbanisation of the shopping experience and urbanisation in general means that people develop what he called the blasé attitude. A term now that's kind of used in everyday life, but again, comes from Simmel, where people almost deliberately develop a kind of dehumanised relation with other people and things as a survival mechanism in a city. It's really hard to kind of, emotionally relate to everyone around you when there's hundreds of thousands of people, particularly when there's homeless people and stuff like that. There's all these problems that you feel like you have no control over. Simmel argues that we develop this kind of detached, blasé kind of attitude towards things because of this kind of stuff. So, to sum up this section, throughout these developments happen mostly in the 20th century, and again we're talking here about physical developments of kind of buildings in a way, and technology and movement of things rather than the internet, which will come up later in the course. We'll look at the implications of that throughout. But shopping in this sense changes, becomes as much about looking rather than speaking. So, where one buys something becomes as important about what one buys. So notions of value here change. And pretty much, we're moving much more to an idea of symbolic value over use value in these things. So, again, a shoe is not just a shoe. Shoe is not just something that kind of you put on your feet so they don't hurt. They become things to symbolise other stuff, your fashion sense or your wealth or status or whatever. Shopping becomes about not just work, i.e. what we were talking about in the week when we spoke about Miller, the necessity of buying stuff and the self-sacrifice that most often women did to provide for the family. It becomes as much about leisure practices, something to do. Malls are both places to look at stuff, but also a place to be looked at. And again, that relates to Benjamin's idea of flaneur. They become about desire rather than need. So, we still go and buy, our fruit and veg and stuff to eat, but we don't necessarily need a Switch.
Yes.
Or an iPad or whatever. So we start to kind of, again, relating some of the Frankfurt School material here, pursuing our wants rather than needs, and this becomes problematic in lots of ways, particularly as we'll look later on, in terms of sustainability. There's also a kind of change here in terms of necessity where marketing and becomes directed more towards women in this sense, and particularly middle-class women, although more recently this is changing and working-class women are targeted as well, and this is parodied a lot in things like Kath and Kim. And things like feminist critiques and class issues become imbued in the way that these things develop and the way that people experience them, and there's really an amazing array of research on that kind of stuff. As I said, there's also the rise of platform capitalism, which kind of challenges many of the things we're talking about. It's not an extra thing, it's kind of a layer, I suppose, on top of this infrastructure. All that infrastructure we're talking about still exists. The internet still becomes a kind of disseminating method and a PR and advertising thing that is kind of happening within and with and through all this kind of physical infrastructure that many of the stuff we'll be looking at later in the course covers.
I think it's a really good point, because I think what the mall did was try to put a lot of things you might not need in front of your eyes. As you use it as a kind of leisure space and a social space, as many things in front of your eyes as possible that you could potentially buy. Now those things come in front of our eyes in so many different ways, and often in quite intimate settings and different ways, but yet we're often then go to the mall to purchase it still, even if we or try it on and then buy it online or whatever. You'll often see people in a shop looking at something and then also looking at it online to see, can I get it cheaper, can I do this, try on the shoe, buy that size online, etc. So I think you're right. I don't think we see a replacement. We just see a kind of merging of different ways in which products are viewed and target people, etc.
That's right. It's not really either or, it's kind of and, I suppose.
I think it's and, definitely. And thinking back to the idea of public space, meeting at the mall becomes, if you don't have anywhere else to go, You can't think of anywhere else to go. You don't have much imagination to go, particularly at certain periods in people's lives, teenage years and maybe young adults. Meeting at the mall, often especially in places where there's really nowhere else to meet that's safe, clean, easy to get to, etc. It does become this kind of replacement for the square, the plaza, the park even.
Yeah, growing up in Cessnock, there was no malls at all. So when we got our Ps, our licence, we'd all jump in a car and drive down to Charlestown Square, right? It was like a thing to do. It was exciting. So,
place of desire.
Place of desire.
Which I think, again, if we go back to sort of Miller's idea, it's easy to be critical, but then I think we're all implicated in different ways of a place we would go and hang out. So I think it's a really interesting one for us all to think about is, where has that place been in different parts of your life that you automatically just go to meet people? And what happens when it disappears, especially when during pandemics, for example, essential items were not necessarily malls, so their worth was really kind of put into question and quite obviously kind of siphoned off from supermarkets and where you get essentials.
Yeah. Okay, we'll leave this section of that and come back and talk about place and non-place.